All right. So, hello, everyone. I am so excited to welcome you to today's conversation. Just quickly wanted to introduce myself. My name is Nicole. I'm the Associate Marketing Manager at Power to Fly, and I will be helping out with facilitation and moderation for today's conversation. As you know, Power to Fly is a company that works to connect underrepresented talent with companies, both large and small. And I know Sienna is going to dive into that more. And I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Sienna, who's going to give us a presentation and then dive into Q&A. And so be sure to drop all of your questions in the Q&A slot next to the chat box. And so without further ado, we have the one and only Sienna Brown on the line. Sienna Brown is a senior manager of global DEI strategy at Power to Fly, where she focuses on long-term impact and innovation. Her mission is to help build inclusive companies and communities so that underrepresented talent can thrive. Over the past 6 years, her focus has been working with companies and employees to create more diverse and inclusive workforces that have a positive impact on their personal and professional lives. When she's not working, she's at home on the Mediterranean coast, watering her plants, cooking a good meal, or free diving. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Sienna, and let you kick us off here.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole, for the lovely introduction. And so I'm going to share my screen, and if y'all can just give me a quick thumbs up, or I can see your screen in the chat, definitely just let me know so that we're on the same page. So I'm really excited about our conversation today. We're going to be talking about how to level up your DEI initiatives. And like Nicole said, I'm going to dedicate about 30 minutes to sharing with you all some of the best practices that we see in our work that we do at Power to Fly, where a lot of companies want to make an impact, and just really being able to help you all understand how to have even more impact with the work that you're all doing. And thank you, Gina, Satsuki, Ming, and Andre for sharing. Also, Andre, your name looks familiar. I feel like I know you from somewhere. Okay, so let's get into it. I want us to start us off really quickly. If some of you are new with Power to Fly, who we are and what our mission is. And so for us, our mission is to fast track economic equality by upskilling and connecting underrepresented talent to roles in highly visible sectors. And so who am I? Nicole gave me a lovely introduction, but I'm the senior manager of global DEI strategy here at Power to Fly. And so I focus on long-term impact and as well as innovation to build inclusive companies and communities so underrepresented talent can thrive. What does that actually look like? Like, what is my work on a day-to-day basis? So for me, that's really being able to lead our team and help other companies that we work with in regards to consulting, training, in listening circles, internal events, literally a whole 360 platform to be able to say, how can we help set you up for success? So before we move into it, I want to share a little bit about the difference between intention and impact, okay? So there was a survey back in 2019 from the Boston Consulting Group that surveyed over 16,500 employees from around the world. And it was interesting because in this survey, 50% of the employees from underrepresented groups said that they experienced bias on a day-to-day basis. While that happened to be true, 97% of them said that their company had a diversity program in place. Okay, and so I think that this is really interesting because as we think about the upscale that we've kind of seen in diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically over the past year, a lot of times, a lot of companies have intention, right, of like, well, we're launching all these diversity programs and doing all of these things, et cetera, but really we don't take a step back to ask ourselves, are we actually having impact with the individuals that this is supposed to be impacting most, right? And we'll talk a little bit about what those groups look like in a second, but I think this is really important. So 97% of people said their company had a diversity program in place, while 50% of employees still felt like they experienced bias on a day-to-day basis. We take it a step further, and only 25% of the people in the companies said that they had personally benefited from their diversity program. And so again, I really want for all of us to take from this today the importance of like intention versus impact and making sure that the time, energy, effort, and resources that we're putting into these things that we're trying to have intention and do in a way that's actually going to have impact are actually impacting the individuals that we want to, okay? So how do we shift from intention to impact? I want us to focus on a couple of different things. But before we continue, I want to be clear about how we're defining DEI, okay? So obviously, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if we take it a step further, we also can add B to be belonging, right? But I want to break down and talk a little bit about why diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of the times in our companies, we think that it's like this stepchild that like lives on the side, right? Or like DEI, where sometimes we don't have budget or we don't have time or we don't have effort to put into that. But instead it's being able to say, hold on, when we think about DEI as becoming a part of our company DNA, right? When we think about it and being able to say, like, this isn't just the how are we checking off the box or doing this because everyone else is doing this, but actually asking ourselves, like, how can we build workforces, workplaces, companies where every single individual feels like they can show up as their most authentic self, right? I could share stats for years about why having an inclusive workplace matters, but I really want us to start off with diversity. And so I want us to, my background is in psychology, like from way back in the day. And so I think a lot of the times before we talk about action, we need to talk about the way that we think about things in our mindset, right? And so diversity is a lot more than just being diversity around race or ethnicity, diversity around gender, or diversity around sexuality. Something that I think is really important is that when we think about diversity, it's as important as being able to say, what does diversity look like in regards to, do I have more introverts on my team or do I have more extroverts? What does diversity look like in regards to if you have parents on the team? What does it look like in regards to those who might be, or who might, or who might have different neurological, oh my goodness, my screen, different neurological things going on, right? And so really asking ourselves, like, when we think about diversity, what does that actually look like and what does that actually mean for us? And how are we able to think about it in a way that's a little bit more authentic instead of just what we think we can see with the person in front of us, right? So background of diversity of experiences, of professional opportunities, of education, right? And really just expanding our thoughts around that. Sorry, my brain had like a mental fart when I was going through that. Okay, so let's go next. So it shouldn't just be the job of diverse individuals on your team to have us talk about this. And when we think about diversity and making change in regards to our diversity efforts, it really needs to be spearheaded by allies, because that's who's going to be able to have the most impact, right? So really quickly in the chat, give me a quick thumbs up if you've heard of the term allyship before. And I was like, and if you've ever attended one of our trainings, you definitely should. I see Tessa, who has taken a ton of my training, so she definitely knows. Okay, Jennifer, Jeff, Victoria, Tawana, wonderful. And so the reason why this is so important, and I love seeing the chat being so engaged, the reason why having allies really spearhead this is the same way why we need to be able to say, like, if, and I always call Nicole, who she's not on camera right now, but Nicole is like a #1 ally of being able to say, like, how can I create space to be able to create opportunities for others who are out there, right? And so it shouldn't be, for example, if I'm championing for someone in the workplace and I want to be an ally, it shouldn't necessarily be because they're asking me to, or because it's getting to a point where they're complaining, because I think something that's important is, like, we shouldn't have to wait until we get to the point where we hit a problem and then that's where we become reactive, but instead saying, how are we proactively making sure that everyone has a seat at the table? And we'll talk about this in a second. And really not tasking this to the people who are diverse on your team. And I think that this has happened a lot, or this does happen quite often, where you have someone who might represent a certain thing, and they have to be the person to champion for that, or they have to be the person to have the conversation with all the other employees in the workforce. And what we don't think about is, like, what is the emotional and or mental toll that might take on your diverse individuals on the team that they might not necessarily want to show up for or have to be the spokesperson for, but instead being able to say, how can we have allies really be able to make the case for this, okay? So next, I want us to think about equity. And when we think about equity, yes, we're talking about like economic equity, but I also want us to think about like equity to access of resources, right? when we're thinking about promotions, or when we're thinking about who moves up in our company, when we're thinking about who has a chance to speak equally, right? And really leaning into that, and then asking ourselves, like, when we think about affinity bias is essentially the tendency to prefer individuals who appear similar to ourselves, right? And so I want you to think about the individuals that you work with right now. And I want you to think about, like, who are the people that you vibe well with? Who are the people that you say, oh, I love working with them. It's so great. You recommend them for things, for new projects, etc. And then I want you to take a step back. And if you're taking notes, like, do this reflection exercise later, but ask yourself, how similar are these individuals to yourself? And then ask yourself, do you represent what a lot of other individuals in the company look like, right? And this goes back to the concept that we were talking about with allyship, of being able to say, hold on, so if we have a pretty homogenous company, not country, if we have a pretty homogenous company, right? Or if we have a company that we might be really diverse, but when we're asking who's in leadership, who are the people who have the, like, biggest voice out there? And then asking ourselves, like, affinity bias is real. Like, I would love for everyone in the world to not have biases, but we do. And something we'll talk about is, like, awareness, action, and accountability. But it's like being aware of the fact that we have biases, that things like affinity bias do exist, but then asking ourselves, like, how can we, and not just us, but leadership as well, be intentional in being able to say, do we prefer other individuals to ourselves? And are we creating equitable opportunities for those who happen to be different than us? Okay. And the last thing that I want us to cover is inclusion. And I think that this is one of the most important parts, because a lot of the times we work with companies that are either having a ton of different hiring efforts, or they want to bring on more diverse talent, whatever that might look like. And then at the end of the day, they don't do the thought of, like, but hold on, are we an inclusive company? If we do start diversifying our team, will they honestly and truthfully feel welcome, right? And so what I want us to think about in regards to inclusion is that it's about more than having just a seat at the table. And this is a term that I was like, has been around for quite some time, but I think it's definitely been a little bit more frequent in the past couple of years. But, like, when you think about it, it's not just about having a seat at the table, right? Like, that's the first part. But then asking yourself, like, have you ever gone to a different, imagine that you're vegan, okay? So imagine that you're vegan, or you might be vegan. Do we have any vegans who are attending right now? And you go to a dinner party, and you sit down at the table, and there are no vegan plates, right? But you were invited to the dinner party. You have a seat at the table. The people around you are like, oh, this is great. Jeff, I'll use you as an example because you said you're a vegan. Jeff's a vegan, and I might know that if I know him well enough, but there's no food that you enjoy or food that you can eat, right? And so thinking about that, it's not just about having a seat at the table, but it's about being able to say, hold on, there are food options that everyone's going to be able to have access to. There are different ways, like, there's people who are also around the table that everyone should be able to find someone that they can connect with in some way. And so I see Christopher saying that's powerful, great analogy. Thanks. And, like, again, I was like, this is why I love talking about this stuff, because it's not just like, again, oh, diversity, equity, and inclusion, what does that mean? But it's about being able to say, like, hold on, how can we, although we might not necessarily live these things in our day-to-day lives, like, aligning it with something that we can understand, and being able to say, like, when we think about all of those different parts, is saying, okay, well, everyone is invited, right? Everyone is invited. Not only that, but some chairs aren't taller than others, right? Everyone has a seat at the table. And not only that, but whoever's creating the table, right, which is us who are here as decision makers in our companies, are actually able to say, I'm going to be intentional enough to ask everyone who's coming what their food preferences are, right? And then make sure that I have plates for everyone. And, like, that's what I want us to think about when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our companies, okay? And this is so important because, again, when we think about making change and going from intentions of, like, checking off boxes or thinking about things we can do, to actually being able to say, hold on, let's take it a step further. Yes, it might take more time, energy, and effort, but we know that it's going to be worth it, because, using the table analogy, we know that everyone's going to come back to the next dinner party. And we know that everyone's going to love it, and then go and talk to their friends about how amazing of an experience they had because the host went above and beyond. So imagine, and I want to go back to like, going back to the concept of when we're thinking about creating more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces, like the best way to look at this is like the biggest champions for your company will be the people that are on your company. So asking yourself right now, like everyone who's a part of my company, would they champion and say, oh, I love working here. It's such a great place. The host, or in this case, our leadership team or everyone on the team is so intentional. Okay. So I want to share a little bit about my story with you really quickly, and I will keep it short because I do want to be able to create space for questions, which I see that we are already getting some in, but I want to share a little bit about my story with you. This is me on the left-hand side with my mother, my grandmother, who are the most wonderful individuals. And then this is me on the right-hand side last year. And when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think something that happens a lot is a lot of times individuals either don't feel comfortable talking about it, or they're not sure because they don't want to say the right thing, et cetera. And something that I found, and I think that is so powerful over the past 6 years, is that the most beautiful part is like having everyone be able to show up authentically as themselves without being afraid of like judgment or feeling afraid that like they need to be someone else to be able to fit in. And so I'm sharing these photos of when I was younger because I grew up, well, obviously I'm Black, not obviously, I'm a Black African-American woman. And I grew up in Brooklyn, but then we moved to a very small town, upstate New York, where we were the only Black family in a town of 5,000 individuals. And so I really had to learn how to be a chameleon, right? So I was too white, or I spoke white, or I acted white in the Black community. And then in the white community, I never fit in because I was the only Black girl. And that was something that I struggled with for quite some time. And it wasn't until I did a lot of unlearning and I did a lot of self-therapy and real therapy and realizing that like the most beautiful thing that we can do for ourselves and others is show up authentically as we are and be able to change the narrative, not just for ourselves, but for other individuals as well. And so the photo on the right, I'm in Spain, which is where I'm at right now. So it's about 5:30 here, but I share this photo on the right because I think something that is so impactful about my journey, both personally and professionally, is being able to have had not just allies, but also representation of other people like me. And that isn't just with race and gender, but also with background, with experience, with where I went to school, all of these things. Be able to change the narrative of what we think is possible for ourselves and breaking through limiting beliefs. And then also being intentional about finding work opportunities where I feel like I can show up as my full self, right? Where I feel like I don't have to try to be someone different than who I am, right? And so if anyone who works with me knows me, like I'm myself, whether I'm in this call with you all or whether I'm in a leadership meeting or whether I'm working with a client, because for me showing up as myself will hopefully empower other people to do the same, okay? So I want us to transition, right? And I actually want us to transition. I'll go through this, and then Nicole, if you can make a note to have Elizabeth's question there, I definitely want to answer that moving forward. I want us to kind of move through, and I want us to talk a little bit about the 3 key factors to being intentional about your DEI initiatives, okay? And so this is something that I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I feel like repetition is definitely the way that we learn. And so there are 3 key factors to being intentional about your DEI initiatives, right? And the first one is awareness. If anyone remembers the other 2 that I had shared before, definitely drop it in the chat. I want to see how engaged we are right now. And also, if I happen to be speaking too quickly, I want to be conscious of the fact that sometimes when I'm speaking in English, I also speak in Spanish, but when I speak in English, I could speak very quickly. So if you'd like for me to slow down, just let me know in the chat and I'm more than happy to, okay? So the first key factor to being intentional about your DEI initiative is awareness. And so what I really want to lean into here is that a lot of the times when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, we say, okay, well, we have our demographics and we know where we want to be going and X, Y, and Z. And I really want us to like lean into the fact that it's not just about data. it's about more than that, because again, like, people aren't numbers, you know what I mean? People aren't numbers, and we really need to be able to lean in and learn how to be able to say, like, when we bring awareness, I've seen a lot of companies in the past year really say things like, oh, well, we've done a data analysis and we've kind of compared where we are with other companies in our field. And so we've projected where we want to be going. And what lacks is like being able to ask the right questions and being able to fully understand and lean in, not just what you want to find out, but what you need to find out. And I think that this is important because something that I found in a lot of the companies that we work with is like, and also companies that are trying to do different DEI initiatives, is that when you ask specific questions, like the questions that we ask matter so much. And when you ask specific questions, you're framing them because you want to hear a specific answer, right? And again, we're doing this with our best intention because we think we know what the problems are at our company, or we think we know where we need to grow. But it's not until you're able to have like a third party come in and be able to say, oh, hold on, like I was like being unbiased, right? So being unbiased because like our goal is to be able to say, well, how do we help you get better, right? It's about asking the right questions and then also leaning into things that's more than just data, but really getting to know the individuals in the company, not just with what they do for work, but across the board, right? And there's a difference between being performative and intentional. And so when we think about awareness and when we think about awareness regarding our DEI practices that we're trying to implement, like a lot of people, and I was like, I'll be very frank, after the murder of George Floyd, there were a ton of companies that posted black squares, that put out statements, that did all of the things. But then when we ask ourselves, like thinking of the stats that we had back at the beginning of the presentation, like what's actually changed, right? And I think that that's something really important to think about. And again, going from being performative, like putting out statements and doing things, versus saying like, hold on, how are we intentionally being aware about where we're at as a company right now, right? And then being able to learn or understand where we want to be, but doing that with clarity and doing that with confidence. And when we do that, and when we have intentionality behind our actions, that allows for not just people who are within our company, right? I mean, obviously for people who are within our company, but then also externally it shows. And you know the companies that feel good, who are doing diversity, equity, and inclusion right, because you can see it, you can hear it, they kind of like breathe it and live it. And so I want to pause there, and I want us to move forward to action. And again, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A section. And I was like, I'm buzzing through this because I do want to be able to give us time towards the end for us to be able to talk about these questions and kind of have more of a conversation around this. But first, I do think that it is important to kind of see just some of the snapshots of what the differences are, okay? So the second part, and also if we're still with me, I want to make sure, I saw the chat blowing up earlier. I'm hoping you all are actively listening and or taking notes. If you're still with me, give me a quick okay in the chat so that I can know, and then we'll move forward. Elizabeth is saying yes. Okay, perfect. With you, yes, love it. Fantastic. Also thinking about inclusion, the fact that I said okay, I put up the thumbs up sign and said it, and we're seeing, not the thumbs up sign, the okay sign, and even in the chat alone, one message or one command is being communicated in so many different ways, right? And so I love that. And like, I wanna pause and like use this as an example, as we're about 65 people in this room right now saying with one phrase, put okay in the chat. We have so many different ways that you all have just responded, right? And I think it's so impactful because again, like when we think about how we communicate to our teams, how they can perceive that and how they can answer, and then me as a person who might be in a position of power in this conversation right now, not saying that there had to be a right way to say okay or a wrong way to say okay. All right. So I love that. I really just wanted to lean into that because I think that's a beautiful example. Okay, fantastic. So the second part that I want us to lean into is action, right? So awareness and then action. And so I want to talk about what a lot of companies do and or have done for quick fixes and what the intention is. and then what actually happens versus what happens when you want to focus on impact, okay? So a lot of the times, and again, when we think about like checking the boxes, companies say, oh, it's great because we have short unconscious bias trainings in our onboardings, right? And a lot of them are high level and or automated trainings. And so what happens? I want to ask, well, I don't want to put you on the spot, but like a lot of people who take trainings, that's a part of their onboarding, that's like a 30-minute training and then that's it. There's no actual follow-up. There's no learning. There's no implementation around that. Excuse me, there's no implementation around that in their day-to-day practices, okay? And so like the intention is being able to say, let's give people what we need, check off the box and have these different trainings, right? And so I'm gonna share side to side, and I have no more water left. I'm going to share side to side snapshots on the difference between like intention and impact, okay? So high level automated trainings that are a part of onboarding, but that are very hands off. Versus what happens, this is a lot of text, don't worry, I'm going to read it to you. But like impact is like, what would happen if the company decided to host customized training specifically for their needs and desires and having it be continuous and hands-on? So I'm going to read part of this question. So this is one of our testimonials from an unconscious bias attendee from DHI. And it was said, in my experience, I've participated in many corporate training programs that dumb down or over-explain concepts, but was very impressed with how informative yet straightforward this training was. I found value in the mental exercises that we did because it allowed for me to check in and acknowledge my own biases. I appreciate that key takeaways encourage self-reflection, empathy, and communication, which are things that nearly everyone can improve upon. So hearing that, and then also going back to our thought before of like being able to say, a lot of the times people think about DEI as like the stepchild that's over there that we aren't able to dedicate time, energy, or resources to, but instead, I want us to reshape and rethink this of like, how can we empower our employees to be even more intentional in their work and to be able to do things that like are focused on self-reflection and empathy and communication, because again, at the end of the day, that's how we're able to make change, okay? So what's another thing that some companies do for quick fixes, right? A lot of the times, and something that we've seen so often, is starting affinity groups. And while this is fantastic to start affinity groups, and I want to be very clear, having an affinity group versus having an ERG, an employee resource group, are two different things, right? But a lot of companies start DEI affinity groups, and then what happens? People are extremely passionate about it, right? People are really excited. They think of all these plans, they have all of these conversations, they do all of these things while also in addition doing their full-time jobs. And then what happens? Nothing, right? So like they're doing all of this work to want to make change, but instead, like because there's no actual structure or strategy behind it to be able to say, how do we actually make sure that we're able to make change in things like, how are we communicating externally? How are we growing our client base and being more inclusive? How are we having a better or more inclusive company culture, right? So again, that's a snapshot of intention. And again, intention doesn't mean that things aren't happening, but it just means like, are they having the most impact that you want to be able to see? Okay. And so the impact would look like working with a dedicated DEI strategist and actually building a tactical strategy. So I'm going to give a quick shout out to Tessa, who's here. And I work with Tessa on a weekly basis. We've been working together since June for the work that we do with consulting and strategy. And something that Tessa shared was Sienna and her team helped broke down what initially seemed to be a complex strategy into a tangible and approachable journey. So we have been able to build a clear and intentional action plan for the next 5 years. She's made herself accessible to our team of leaders when we need last minute insights, direction, or impact, and has been adaptable and also holding us accountable to having important and sometimes uncomfortable dialogue around DEI initiatives. And like, I really just want to shout this out, number one, because like, I love working with their team. Y'all are amazing. But also because like, there's a difference between trying to do it all on your own versus like having a subject matter expert. It's the same thing. Like, if you want to be really serious about losing weight, right? Let's use a real life analogy. Let's say that you've hit a point where you need to get really healthy or you really need to lose weight and you've been trying to do it on your own. You've been doing exercise routines, etc. But what happens, right? you don't have a clear plan that you're following. You're leaving it up to yourself to kind of like research and then getting lost in all of the Googles and free PDFs from nutritionists and all of these things. And then you're not holding yourself accountable. And like the difference between doing that or like hiring a personal trainer, you know that the results that you're going to see are going to be 10 times better. And you're working with a professional where like their time and energy is dedicated to you. So that gives you up, or that frees you up, time and energy to actually focus on the other things that you want to be focusing on as well. All right. And then the last thing that I want to focus on before we wrap up and open up for questions is this. So like creating hiring quotas and goals by just like thinking about what you think is possible versus actually doing it strategically, right? And so again, a lot of the times companies want to have more diverse individuals. Companies want to be able to bring on new talent and like top talent, right? But they don't know where to find them. And so you end up wasting time and energy and effort doing your own LinkedIn searches, like with your own methodologies, instead of being able to say, hold on, how can I find that subject matter expert to be able to say, how can they help us not only like create goals, but like strategic goals, you know, but actually being able to say like, how can we introduce you to the people that you're trying to find? And so I want to share this high level quote of what impact looks like. It's like actually being able to gain access to top talent from all over the world and giving them direct access to your company. And I think that this is huge because a lot of the times companies talk about this stuff behind closed doors, but like if I go to your company page right now, what are the faces that I'm going to see, or how am I going to learn about your company's story or values, etc.? When I'm being interviewed by your company, am I going to feel represented, right? Not me personally, but anyone who is underrepresented talent, right? And so this is a quote from one of our, actually someone who was applying for a job at Software One who we work with. It's amazing what Power to Fly is doing in this new way of making companies visible to both young and experienced professionals. With so many companies across the world, this linkage is crucial and you've nailed it. Today's event with Software One was an eye-opener. I didn't know that their biggest footprint was in the DACH region, and I'm based in Germany looking for a career opportunity, right? So again, intention versus impact. You're going to be taking action and putting in time or energy, but saying, do we want to be able to try and do these things on our own, or do we want to be able to have even more impact in less amount of time, but doing it more strategically and saving, at the end of the day, time, energy, and resources to be able to work with individuals that know what's up, okay? And so the last part that I want us to talk about is accountability, right? So how are you making sure that, again, the nutritionist factor, right? Like, how are you making sure that you have someone who's always able to be there? And so when we're thinking about your DEI initiatives, here we have exactly what I just said, right? So instead of losing the time, effort, and money towards spreading your employees thin, right? Because that's another thing, like a lot of the times these are other things that are given to people who already have full-time jobs, right? I want you to think about like, how can we start reimagining investing, working with a dedicated team to help you reach, set, and strategically implement your DEI goals, okay? So something that I love to say is that, like I was saying, like the stepchild analogy before, like when we're thinking about moving from intention to impact, I want you to start thinking about DEI, not as its own thing, but like becoming a part of your company DNA, becoming something that your team like lives and breathes, okay? And so I want to continue the conversation. If you want to ask us more specific questions offline, shoot us an email at hi@power2fly. And now we're going to answer all of your questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I want to start off with, oh, Nicole's back. Perfect. Nicole is going to ask some of the questions that we've got in the chat. Hello.
Hello.
And let's get to it.
And Sienna, I just want to commend you because really, I mean, getting to listen to you speak, it always is so inspiring. And I love the analogy that you use, especially because, you know, who doesn't love talking about food and bringing the food into the mix? And so I think that that's always such a great analogy. And it's always really just inspiring to listen to you speak. So thank you. And I know we had a few different questions that came in. So thank you to everyone who's dropping those. And you can upvote questions in the Q&A, drop your questions in the Q&A. But I wanted to kick us off here with one that is very important given what's happening across the US right now. So we had a question that came in from Nava that said, how can companies show support for their employees given the rise in violence and racism towards the AAPI community?
Absolutely. So Nava, this is a great question, and actually something that's been on my mind for the last couple of months recently, just because I know that recently there were the shootings that happened in Atlanta, but since March of last year, there's actually been increased violence towards the AAPI community as a whole, unfortunately. And so when we think about what companies can do around that, the first thing that I would say is like, be able to host a safe space for individuals to talk about their experiences, their grievances, and how they're kind of feeling about this, right? That's one thing that we can do. The second thing that we can do is like be intentional about how leadership is communicating this, right? And like having it be something that is proactive versus reactive. So reaching out to your team, drafting up a statement, talking about the importance around it. And then the third thing that I was going to say, which might seem simple, but a lot of people really overlook this, is giving your AAPI employees space. And I say that because something that happens, and this happens, or like I've actually experienced this, is like when you happen to be in a marginalized community and there happens to be more increased violence towards that community, it hurts in a different way, right? I remember last summer there was a lot of time and space when we were like with police brutality, et cetera. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is a way to support the AAPI community is talking to the members on your team and offering to give them space, but actually meaning it, right? And I say that because a lot of the times it's like, okay, well, yeah, take the space or time you need, but you don't feel like you actually can because it doesn't feel authentic, or it doesn't feel like it's just like they're saying it to check off a box. So I encourage you all to actually be able to reach out and like talk to your employees and be able to say, if you need to take time and space, not just because it's what Sienna said, right? But because you truly believe that like you want to be able to have them show up as their best selves. And if they're dealing with trauma or hurt or fear, right? Like there's a lot of fear right now. And that's something that I think a lot of us can't conceptualize unless we've lived it, of being able to say like, if you're a part of this community, you might actually feel fear of like leaving your house because an attack like that could happen to someone who looks like you. And so really just trying to practice compassion as well and understanding.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sienna. And thank you so much for the questions. We also had another question that came in the chat that I thought is really great from the perspective of the person asking this, and then also for other people and allies who are trying to support people. So D&I initiatives in many companies focus primarily in awareness, education, and hit a hiring target based on race and physical attributes. My own experience has been that I have not been invited to the table where important decisions are being made due to corporate hierarchy. How to get that invitation? I don't look or sound like most of the people in authority.
Okay, I was like, I'm going to reread this to make sure that I'm completely answering this. So, awareness, education, in my own experiences. Okay, this is a question. This is a great question. So essentially, the question is like, how can I get a seat at the table for those conversations, right? And maybe I'm overconfident, but I was going to say like, start inviting yourself. And I say this because like, ironically enough, like with the work that I do at Power to Fly and a little bit about my journey, something that I actively did or proactively did was like sharing thoughts or feedback or ideas, right? And so odds are, Anna, you were saying that like you want to be able to be a part of those conversations. And so my recommendation would be to express your interest, right? And then also not just express your interest outright, but then also share bits of information or things that you think could be useful. And the more that you start sharing your thoughts around this, they might be able to say, oh, hey, like, that's a good idea, or that's something that I would love to implement, or, oh, we had never thought about that before, right? And again, this could happen if it sounds like most of the people who are in authority, it might be a homogeneous group, but just kind of like taking time out and like lightly raising your hand until you're able to have maybe not an invitation to sit at the table yet, but like an invitation to be able to share your thoughts and opinions until that becomes a little bit more aligned.
Thank you, Sienna.
And hopefully that's helpful.
I had a follow-up question to your answer for the AAPI community. I think it's really important, especially moving forward from Chandra. So Chandra asks, in giving employee space, how do we maintain the level of concern for the individuals and curb apathy? Many may feel unimpacted.
Yeah, I love that. Asking, so Chandra, I want to be conscious about pronouncing your name right. Sorry. So Chandra, something that I would say is like, when we think, and I talk about this a lot in trainings, specifically around inclusive leadership, right? So there's a bias which has to deal with like me making a decision for you, right? Without actually asking you about what you want. And so it's not necessarily saying that we're going to everyone in the AAPI community and saying, take space and take time off, you need it. But instead putting that offer out there. And then if they don't want it, then like, that's also okay, you know, because it's the same thing. Like there might be people or individuals who are unimpacted and they're just kind of like, okay, let's keep going. And so it's fine. So you have that conversation or you make that initiative. And if they don't want it, that's okay. But never feeling that like everyone in the same community is going to want the same things. And I know that's not what you're saying, but just being conscious that like everyone will react in a different way, but being able to provide the opportunities for those individuals who will. And at the end of the day, like we won't know what other people want unless we ask them. And then once we do hear from them, then we're able to say, okay, dope. I hear your answer. I respect it. And then we carry on with our days. Or not with our days, but like then we're able to move forward and not feel that sense of apathy.
Thank you so much, Sienna. And I have a great question from Sharon that also ties into a question from Paloma. And so the question is, what are some effective ways to get buy-in from leadership so that they do incorporate DEI into the DNA of the company? Oftentimes there is enthusiasm for the initiative, but DEI can easily fall off when decisions are made. And the question from Paloma was, what is the most effective way to start up DEI efforts for a lasting impact? So I think they tie together pretty nicely.
Yeah, absolutely. Love these questions. Tie it to business growth. I was like, as simple as that sounds, like if you're going to do it, again, a lot of the times it's like people do things reactively versus proactively, right? Which is why we saw a huge surge in DEI initiatives in last June, and then that's continued to go. But like when you're actually able to say, okay, being a more inclusive workplace, right? Being a more inclusive workplace means that people are able to show up. They're going to love doing their job more. There's tons of stats around this out there, but they're going to love being in the workplace because they feel like they can show up as their fullest selves. Odds are they're going to be more encouraged to do the work. And at the end of the day, if they're doing the work, they're making the company money, right? And so when you think about it in that way, it's like, no, DEI isn't a DEI thing. DEI is being able to say, how can we make sure that we all feel included and that we all feel like we have a company culture that matter, or that a company culture where we matter? Then we're all going to want to come to work and do our best work. And then at the end of the day, we're going to see more money in the company, right? And so I think a lot of the times it's like making that connection. And I also, again, like, I just want to remind us that, like, yes, we're talking about DEI, but DEI is company culture. DEI is leadership. DEI is who are our clients, right? DEI is how are we communicating externally? DEI is so many different things. And so again, when I say company DNA, like, I mean company DNA, you know what I mean? But it's just like DEI has this term around it that it feels like the separate thing, instead of being able to say, like, how can we be a workplace where everyone, not just a workplace, but like, how can we be a company where we're able to really pour into, and not just our employees, but our communities as well, to be able to reshape and re-envision the future for where the world is going.
Thank you so much, Sienna. I know I keep saying thank you, but I love all of these great answers and all of these great questions. So really, thank you. And thank you all for being here. And we had a really great question that came in from Elizabeth that I wanted to make sure that we touched upon. So the question was, I want to make a workplace where there is psychological safety, in parentheses, people can show up as themselves, but there's a top-down, ego-driven dynamic at my workplace. How can I tell if there's really potential to change this toxic situation, or if I should find a more inclusive place?
Yeah, That's a great question. I was like, I love talking about psychological safety and also just like making the best decisions for yourself. But let's talk about it. So there's a top-down, ego-driven dynamic at work. How can, if there's really potential to change? I would ask yourself a couple of different questions, right? The first question that I would ask is there an ability to be able to have an ally in that room to start making change? And I say that because, like, while right now there might be a top-down ego-driven dynamic, sometimes it takes one person stepping in. It might not necessarily be you, but it could be someone else stepping in and bringing that sense of intentionality of like, hey, at the top, we're really ego-driven, of course, with like love and agency, but like, I would ask yourself, is there a way to have an ally start stepping into that room? And then the second thing that I would ask yourself is like, how much effort and or energy has the team as a whole or you as an individual been putting towards that, right? And then the third thing that I would ask yourself is, if the answer is no to those two questions, those weren't yes or no questions, but if the answers are towards the negative side for both of those questions, then asking yourself, what is it that you would need to be happy in the workplace? And then if you say that, like, I can't find that where I'm at, then it might be time to transition, you know? And again, transition to a more inclusive place. Again, something that I love about all the companies that we work with at Power to Fly is that they're really companies that care. And so they're out there, they exist. And so it's really just being able to connect those two dots. But that's a great question, Elizabeth. And again, like, when we think about psychological safety, I think this is a beautiful example of DEI isn't just like, how are we hiring more Black people? But DEI is really being able to say like, hey, like me as an individual, do I feel like I have psychological safety to talk to my manager about issues that I'm facing? Do I feel like I have psychological safety to show up as my full self to work? Do I feel like I have psychological safety to share my thoughts or opinions without them getting broken down or feeling like people are laughing at me in a Zoom meeting, whatever that looks like? And so, and also like, am I in a workplace where I'm actually able to make change? And I think that that's one of the most important questions that we can all be asking ourselves. And also that's the most important question that we can be asking ourselves as leaders of companies as well. It's like, does our team feel like they're at a place where they feel empowered to be able to make
Amazing.
change?
And yes, when we talk about DEI, it is so important to also talk a lot about psychological safety. I couldn't agree more. And thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that question. So we have another question that came in from Melissa that I wanted to get to because I think it ties really well into performative allyship and outside versus inside. So Melissa asks, I co-chair an inclusive runway show where we are intentional about the diversity, inclusion, and language we are supporting and showcasing on stage. What are ways that we can ensure that we're also showcasing that action backstage as well, where tensions can be high and stressful without coming across as policing people's attitudes via volunteers while we are busy on stage and can't monitor?
Fantastic. Nicole, don't get rid of that question. I want to read it. Oh, another way of thinking about diversity, how people learn and understand things, right? Like hearing that, I was like, this is great, but I need to read it. Perfect. So Melissa, if I understand this question correctly, the question is that there's definitely diversity, inclusion, and language that's being showcased on stage, but your question is, behind the scenes, what can we be doing without policing people's attitudes via volunteers? One thing I would say is like, show gratitude. And that's something that can seem very simple, but continuously showing gratitude towards these individuals, right? The second thing that I would say is being conscious about who those volunteers are, right? And again, I think I'm understanding this question, but like, you can ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion by like, number one, supporting all people that you have behind the stage. Number two, maybe also giving them different opportunities outside of the ones that they might already be doing. So although they're volunteers, but maybe they want to be able to volunteer doing different things. And then the third thing I want to just be able to make sure that I'm fully understanding the question is that how can, without policing people's attitudes via volunteers? I would also say, before we transition, I would also say that the last thing that you could possibly do is, I don't know, I think gratitude is probably the biggest one, of being able to show people that the work that they're doing is valued, that they also feel seen, heard, and celebrated. although they might seem like the work that they're doing is a little bit more tedious or managerial, just like really expressing and showing gratitude is something that I think makes all people feel included. So hopefully I was able to answer that well.
And I think, Sienna, this ties really nicely into companies and that idea of being toxic, right? Like, how can we also demonstrate to the employees that care about DEI that we want to support them there, right? And make sure that those initiatives are coming along. So thank you so much for the question. And okay, I have one last question. I know we only have 4 minutes left here, but I think this is, do we have time for just one more?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, can we do Jennifer's?
That's you read my mind. Okay, so we're on Jennifer's. I was just about to get to there. All right. So if you don't currently have representation during interviews, how can you communicate or intentionally create a space of inclusiveness for the candidates?
Yeah, I love this question. This is something that we talk about all the time in our inclusive hiring training. So if you don't currently have representation in interviews, one of the easiest things that you can do is share stories about times that you've championed for all types of individuals, right? And so that doesn't necessarily have to be, again, there's different types of representation that isn't always just like what we see on the screen, right? But instead really being able to say like one of the, or not questions, but like one of the prompts that I love to give for all interviewing teams is being able to say, like, when is a time that you have championed for someone that's different than yourself, right? And so, number one, that's a great thing to ask, that's a great thing to ask an applicant, but that's also a great thing for you as a company to be able to share, right? And so really talking about times that you've championed for other individuals. And also representation can be something as simple as like having pronouns in your email. Like there are literally people who have joined companies when they saw like men in leadership have he, his in their pronouns because it meant that they were being inclusive, right? So it doesn't always need to be like physical representation, but it can also be things like sharing times that you champion for all types of individuals. And yeah, that's it.
Love it. Thank you. And last question that I know we got 2 minutes here, but I think you can answer it very quickly. So Paloma asks, how can we start talking about DEI initiatives in a global company with no cited priority?
Yeah, I love this question, Paloma. And also, again, global DEI strategy. For me, this is really important. I've been living in Spain for the past 6 years. And so it's always so interesting to kind of be able to think about DEI as something that does seemingly be very US focused, but asking about like it's interesting because like for DEI, there's a huge focus on race and ethnicity in the States. In Spain, that's not even in their top 5 because again, it's a different situation, a different demographic. And so again, when thinking about it in like, how can we most impact change in the company and what does that look like? So maybe that won't necessarily be around race or ethnicity or gender, et cetera, but really being able to say like DEI, again, going back to the parts that it also has to do with inclusion, how can we be able to create better company cultures on a global scale? And so I hope that answered your question. And Nicole, I want to pass it back over to you and also just quickly give a shout out to all of you who are still here and for taking this hour of time to learn, to connect, and to ask all of these amazing questions. And Nicole, I feel like I always take your job towards the end, so I'm going to let you go.
Not a problem. Happy to give it away. I want to say thank you to everyone on the line about the recording. We are recording. This will be sent to you in a follow-up email so you can spread it far and wide with anyone who you think it might be useful for. And I really just want to thank all of you. And thank you, Sienna, for sharing your insights with us, for sharing your advice. And, you know, I know that you shared it before, but in the last minute, could you tell us how to follow up with you after this?
Absolutely. Great question. And actually, again, the way that we communicate, I was literally just writing it in the chat. So definitely feel free to reach out to us at hi@power2fly. If you want to reach out to me directly, Sienna@power2fly, and I would love to, our whole team would love to continue the conversation, get to know more, and also hear where you all are at with your DEI journeys and see how we can support, because that's what we're here for. And thank you all again for taking out the time and joining us for this hour.
Yes, thank you so much. And again, thank you, Sienna. And I did just want to shout out as well that we are having a mini summit happening the second week of April, which is all about elevating Black women. And so we're going to be talking about ways that we can continue to support Black women in the workplace and celebrate the achievements that we've been able to accomplish. Although we have a long way to go, there have been some changes that have come, unfortunately, due to so many social injustices. But we're going to celebrate that the second week of April. So I hope to see you all there. We've got some fantastic speakers and some fantastic topics. And so I will drop that in the chat. But until then, thank you all and have an awesome afternoon, evening, or rest of your morning.
Thanks, y'all. Have a great day.